So in our previous session we discussed the modernist poets such as W.B. Yeats and T.S. Eliot. Now we will focus our attention towards the postmodernist poets. So the postmodernist poets you will have to study as part of your syllabus include Dylan Thomas, Philip Larkin and Sylvia Plath. All these figures are important with respect to your TEE preparation, but Sylvia Plath would undoubtedly be the most important among these poets. Hence, today we will focus our attention towards Sylvia Plath and the Confessional School of Poetry. Before moving to the life and works of Sylvia Plath as such, let's have a quick overview regarding the Confessional School of Poetry. For the attention of all my learners, this falls under Block 10, Unit 50 of our official study material on MEG-1 titled British Poetry. So you may turn on to page number 38. Unit 50 is titled Sylvia Plath and Confessional Poetry. Before moving on to the textual aspects as such, I would like to give you an overview of confessional poetry. In simple terms, as this very term confession suggests, it is a style of poetry, very personal and often makes use of the first person narration. That is, I, the first person pronoun, is quite often used in the confessional school of poetry. Hence we can say these poems are quite personal and often written in first person narrative and autobiographical in manner too. This is undoubtedly a branch of postmodernism that emerged in US in 1950s. So, if you have studied Philip Larkin, you would have the idea that these writers such as Philip Larkin, they and the movement school of poetry began as a reaction to the dictates of Pound and Eliot and the excess of Dylan Thomas with respect to their writing style. So this reaction against the established intellectual academic poetry took another form in the US, as I mentioned, and traveled there to England with Sylvia Plath. That is, this emerged in the US and from there it traveled to England with Sylvia Plath's work. So the poets involved in this reactionary movement of confessional poetry came to be known as the confessional poets. You need to remember most of the members of the confessional group. Heading the group were Robert Lowell and Theodore Rothek. So they were more like the seniors in the groups. Younger poets like Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton and others learned to write in the same anti-intellectual subjective style. If you find these key terms in your study material, please underline. This falls under page number 38, maybe the third last line. Okay. They wrote anti-intellectual poetry in the subjective style. The members were Robert Lowell, who was more like a mentor to Sylvia Plath. There was this friend of Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton, and Theodore was also a major figure. Moving on to the historical aspects to remember. The year 1959 was quite important in the literary history with respect to the confessional school. That is, two important events took place at this time. The first was the publication of Life Studies. It was a work by Robert Lovell, and the importance of this work is that it heralded a new kind of poetry. In the sense, this marked a departure from the complex symbolism used by Eliot and others and the formal language and style of T.S. Eliot. Hence, there was a change from formal aspects to informal aspects, such as attention on his own self. So, subjective poetry began to evolve. Lowell chose to look inward rather than outward. His work moved away from the classical stance, becoming more personal, more private. This section also mentions the contributions of Robert Lovell. You need to keep that in mind, that this is a general session on confessional poetry. Not everything mentioned here are related to Sylvia Plath. For example, now Life Studies, the work that we just saw, is not a work by Sylvia Plath. I've seen people making such mistakes. It is a work written by Robert Lovell. We haven't gone to the section of the study of Sylvia Plath in detail. This is a general section dealing with confessional group of poetry. Remember that. So, a quick mention regarding Lovell. He became an important influence on the poets of 60s, bringing about an intense breakthrough into very serious, very personal, emotional experience. That is, those issues that were earlier considered as a taboo were openly addressed in his work and the works of other confessional poets. We will see such examples in case of Sylvia Plath when we discuss poems such as The Colossus, Daddy, or Lady Rastus for that matter. The first important incident was the publication of Life Studies. Now let's have a look at the second most important event that took place in 1959. It relates to Allen Ginsberg. He was also a poet, quite different from Lowell, of course. So, a poetry reading by him along with Grigory Kosko and Peter Orlovsky at Columbia University became a controversial public affair. It is mentioned in the textbook. With his reading of Howl, Ginsberg changed the very concept of poetry. That is, he began to regard poetry as a performance, a ritualistic gesture accompanied by music and dance. That was indeed a huge change considering the traditional poetry of T.S. Eliot and others. This was a drastic change. Discarding conventional forms and themes, Ginsberg imparted to poetry a new sense of freedom and spiritual intensity, and that was indeed a drastic change. He took it out of stuffy classrooms onto open stage, and that was the difference. So that's just an overview. Some of these you should remember. Moving on to the origins of confession. As we know, the works of Lovell, Plath, Sexton and others have come to be called confessional poetry. It is a nomenclature that is more a label of convenience for critics. They have grouped all these people together. And if you look at this critic, M.L. Rosenthal, he defined this form of poetry as that in which, I quote, the private life of the poet, especially under stress of psychological crisis, becomes a major theme, I unquote. So whenever you write your answer regarding, may that be Sylvia Plath or any other confessional poetry for that matter, if interested, you can mention this definition put forth by this critic. That would give your answer a glow, maybe an enhancement to your answer. So this would be a good point to mention. You may mark that. See, in Christianity, you must have heard of this term confession. So this is done as if a private utterance, admitting the wrongdoings that you have committed, right? And it gives you mental peace, and it is considered as if an act of salvation, maybe. Yes. So there it is made in front of the priest who represents God. But here, in case of confessional poetry, it is an utterance made before an audience. Confessional poetry thus have all the ingredients of confession. It would pertain to private errors and omissions, fears and phobias too. It must have its roots firmly in the poet's biography. So all these are certain characteristics of the confessional school of poetry. I could see that they have not mentioned the characteristics as such with respect to your study material, but if you are smart enough, you can make characteristics features out of these paragraph explanations. That is, you can say that it is personal and subjective, 1. It is written in first person narration, 2. It has autobiographical elements, 3. Then 4. It expresses deep desires and thoughts in a more rational way. And when you say it's personal, you can say it mentions personal themes. Okay, all these would be the essential characteristics of a confessional poem. So regarding the themes, I told you the poet uses personal themes in case of confessional poetry. So the general themes include failed relationships, nervous breakdowns, suicide, death, disease, father complex, desire to shock, the question of authenticity. All these are often seen, and even influence of psychoanalysis. When it comes to father complex, Electra complex would certainly be there, right? So even the influence of psychoanalysis can be seen. So with respect to your TEE, when you attempt such a question, make sure that you substantiate your statement with a relevant example from any of the texts given in your study material. What do you mean by texts given in your study material? That would be confusing. Let me clarify that. What I meant by text is actually, yeah, exactly, a poem. Okay? Yeah. So I was saying, if you are writing these themes for your TE, make sure that you substantiate your answers with relevant examples from the poems mentioned in your study material. That is how you critically appreciate a work of art. Even if you are writing about Sylvia Plath, you can write, she has mentioned the themes of suicide and what else? Death. And you can quote from Lady Lazarus. It is a poem about her suicide attempts. Okay, and it would be ideal if you could quote lines too, but nevertheless, make sure that you mention a specific poem, one or more specific poem. If it is a general question on confessional poetry, you need not restrict your answer solely towards Sylvia Plath. You can also mention Anne Sexton's works or even Lovell's works for that matter. So, personal themes in confessional poetry would inevitably be related to the poet's growth and childhood. A comparison may be drawn with the autobiographical mode of Wordsworth. As I told you, most of these confessional poetry, not most, all of these confessional poems would certainly be an autobiographical account, right? So, remember the prelude, we discussed this even when we discussed the important questions. Wordsworth's poem, the prelude, it presents a long chronological account of his evolution from an ordinary boy to a sensitive poet. So, the work of the confessional poets are similar in the sense that they look back at the past, picking out significant moments in their experience, but unlike Wordsworth, here the main concern is not with the road taken to fame and glory, rather it deals with the path taken to emotional breakdowns that fascinated. Such a comparison also you could make use of. Even while you are attempting a solo question on Sylvia Plath, you can make this comparison. So this is how you make your answers interesting. Unless I tell you this, I am very sure that the majority would never mention this as part of your answer on Sylvia Plath. So I already helped you with an additional definition to be mentioned, a critical aspect to be mentioned. So plan your answer. If you are lucky, you will get a question on Sylvia Plath. I wish we could see an essay question on Sylvia Plath. Last year they asked that, so yeah, maybe it could be a general question this time. Anyway, please be prepared. So regarding failed relationships, the confessional poets speak of personal failures, that is, failures with respect to marital relationships or any other relationships for that matter. Lovell mentions that in his work Life Studies that we already saw. There he speaks of the failure of marriage. He mentions that the fault lies somewhere in the inability to communicate with his wife. See the level of openness they are writing with. That is, he is mentioning his intermarital problem with the audience. Okay, his issue with his wife. All such aspects can be seen in confessional poetry. Another important theme is father complex. This you can see in the Colossus to a greater extent, and also in Daddy and maybe Lady Lazarus by Sylvia Plath. Yes, so failed relationships in confessional poetry take on other form. This time the poet in the role not of parent but offspring, that is as if a daughter. The child mourning for a lost father is a set context or set stereotypical, what do you say? It's a common theme seen in most of these confessional poems. If you look at Robert Lovell, he speaks of a strained relationship with his father, and we can see that the lady poets there, Sylvia Plath or Anne Sexton, all of these poets seem to suffer from a father complex. That is, there is an inability to accept the loss of the father, a failure to cope with a world removed from his benign influence. So, when you think of father complex, you would certainly have this Electra complex aspect in mind, right? So, when I taught you literary criticism and theory, I remember discussing the Oedipus complex, and as part of that, we also discussed what Electra complex is. So, I suppose you all know about it. Even if not, we will discuss this aspect, this theory, put forth by, who put forth this theory? Let me check your understanding. I suppose everybody knows. Alright, it's very important. Sigmund Freud. You could write the same in case of psychoanalysis too. See, I'll help you with something. We are studying literary theory in order to aid you in your effective writing of critical appreciation. So, if you are a smart learner, you could enrich your answers by switching between the course codes. Doesn't mean you'll have to write literary criticism and theory as part of MEG-1, or doesn't mean you'll have to write MEG-1 for MEG-5. That's not what I exactly meant. What I meant is, when you mention psychoanalysis and Sigmund Freud, you could actually mention that this concept or theory put forth by Freud has been effectively utilized by the modernist and postmodernist poets such as Sylvia Plath, who has emulated this idea in her seminal work Daddy. Likewise, you can bring in your own references, provided you write the right reference and the correct concept. Alright, it would be challenging. It is not a rule to do so. I was just giving you a tip. If you do that, the evaluator would be super impressed with your writing style. I know it's not an easy task, but maybe you can give it a try. Similarly, even when you write the critical appreciation on the poem Daddy, you could bring in psychoanalysis. I've given a detailed lecture on psychoanalysis. Make sure that you study psychoanalysis. It's useful for both the papers. Nervous breakdowns. The theme of mental collapse. Maybe as a result of parental loss. These all are connected. Even as a result of this father complex, mental collapse may happen. And Anne Sexton remembers her father with pangs of guilty conscience. It is mentioned in the study material. She considers herself as a failure, not simply as a daughter but also as a mother. All those instances with examples maybe you can mention if there is a question. The most important theme of suicide, death and disease, you should never forget that. Most of the times the thoughts of these confessional poets turn to self-destruction. Self-annihilation or suicide forms a major theme in their poems. Self-annihilation. This term annihilation I remember explaining. I suppose it was for your batch when we discussed post-colonialism. Yeah. So in their personal lives too, most of them remain suicidal. The quintessential example is Sylvia Plath. Okay. Whenever you mention Plath, never ever forget to mention this theme of suicide, death and disease. Okay. Yeah. It is actually not just simply death that their poetry speaks of. It also deals with physical sickness, disease and decay. Remember that aspect. The desire to shock is also seen in these poems. Use of unconventional themes, outspoken language, at times screaming language is used in some of the works. Expressions of uncontained fury, you can see all those in most of the works. I suppose in Lady Lazarus also you can see instances. We'll come to that. The question of authenticity. There is this question that arises in the minds of the readers, that is, how much of these works, how much of the works by confessional poets is related to authentic experience? How much of it is fiction? So confession after all is assumed to be true. Nevertheless, it is not always first-hand experience that the poets write. You can say that there is some amount of fiction combined with fact in these writings. And I told you that most of these works are written with the first person narration, the use of I, first person singular orientation. It conveys a sense of immediacy and urgency, that's true. And did you know that confessional poetry has a lot in common with dramatic monologue? Have you heard of dramatic monologue? We study dramatic monologue as part of, we study this as part of block 8 of MEG-1, Robert Browning. I have also uploaded my lecture. If interested, you may look into that. Robert Browning was a poet who frequently made use of the technique of dramatic monologue. I suppose you have studied dramatic monologue. Every student of BA would definitely study The Last Duchess, which is a dramatic monologue. So, as the very term suggests, it would be a monologue where a single speaker speaks to a mute listener. And as part of the speech, all the innermost desires and thoughts would be staged. Alright? This is what happens in a dramatic monologue. So it is said that confessional poetry has a lot in common with dramatic monologue, exploring as it does the labyrinths of the mind, diving into motives and intentions. That is what I said, the innermost desires and feelings would be revealed. So the poet sometimes uses a persona that is universally recognized and accepted. This can be considered as if a device used by the confessional poet, an attempt made to impart some kind of universality to the specific poetry in case. That is, even though it is subjective, at times the confessional poet tries to give a universal appeal to this set poem. And as a consequence, the poet at times uses a persona that is universally recognized and accepted. For example, in Sylvia Plath's case, the poet Plath often evokes the figure of Electra. So when we study the poem Daddy in detail, we will see that Electra, this concept is borrowed from Greek mythology. The poem Daddy, she says, is spoken by a girl with an Electra complex. We have already discussed what an Electra complex is. Other confessional poets adopt to different technique. If interested, you may read the details mentioned in the study material. A quick note on the influence of psychoanalysis too. That is, even Electra complex is inspired from psychoanalysis, right? Dealing with the innermost recesses of the mind. The influence of psychoanalytical theories have been very pertinent in the works of the confessional poets, and Sexton's work is a good illustration of this point. As the critic Robert Phillips points out, there is a strong Jungian influence in her work. I saw somebody texting Carl Jung. Good. So in her work, Transformations of the Fairy Tales of Grimm Brothers, Sexton resorts to psychoanalysis to interpret stories that were originally meant for children. So this is also an important aspect with respect to the concept and theory of psychoanalysis put forth by Sigmund Freud. So in this particular session, we discussed the evolution and origins of the confessional school of poetry with specific focus on its characteristics and themes such as failed relationships, then influence of psychoanalysis, the idea of suicide, death, disease, nervous breakdown, and even the question of authenticity. Now we'll focus our attention towards one of the most important confessional poets of all times in literary history, that is Sylvia Plath. Firstly, I'll give you an introduction to Plath. We'll discuss the life and works of Sylvia Plath.